Well, welcome. It's nice to see everybody. Great to be able to share some thoughts with you today. Again, just a heads up that next week, being that it is Tisha B'Av, we won't be having a shir. All sorts of issues with learning on that day, and only certain select things that you can. And usually by about this time on Tisha B'Av, you don't feel like sitting through a Zoom shir, I imagine, although we've never done it before. We will not have a shir next week. We'll continue in 2 weeks' time. Okay. So first of all, welcome. And to those who haven't joined us before, welcome to you. And as we usually do, we just share some thoughts about something topical and something to do with the parsha of the week. And perhaps particularly now that we are in the 9 days. This is the 9 days leading up to Tisha B'Av. So let's begin just by running through some of the rules and regulations of the 9 days and of Tisha B'Av, just as an introduction. Number one is during the 9 days, we may not eat meat or drink wine. Now, there is a usually used explanation for that, and that is that meat and wine are the very foundations of simcha. You know, when you serve a wedding meal or a Shabbos meal, you should have those two things, meat and wine, or chicken and wine. And by the way, for all intents and purposes for this discussion, chicken is regarded as meat as well. So it's meat and wine are used. If we look a little bit deeper, it comes from the fact that in the temple, which we're mourning at this time, in the temple, the main thing of the korbanot, of the sacrifices, was meat. There was also the wine libations. So the two major features of the service in the Beit HaMikdash, in the temple, was meat and wine. How can I be sitting down to a meat and a wine meal, or eating meat and drinking wine, when the temple is in ruins? It seems to be completely untoward, insensitive, not right, and therefore we refrain from having meat and wine for the duration of these 9 days. That is with the exception of Shabbat. So tomorrow night, being that it is Friday night, and for the duration of Shabbos on Saturday, we can eat meat, we can drink wine, and in fact there are those who say that even if you don't usually do it, you must on the Shabbos, because we need to show that Shabbos doesn't carry with it any of the signs of mourning, and certainly not these of eating meat and drinking wine. So that's point number one. Number two, during these 9 days, we are not permitted to do laundry. We're not supposed to wash clothing. Now, the washing of clothing and the wearing of freshly laundered clothing is something that induces a little bit of an element of simcha into our lives. So if you can avoid washing clothing, and we would particularly be talking, I know that Odette was giving us a whole rundown on different items of clothing, but we're talking about really proper outer clothing. We would talk about shirts and suits and dresses and so on, which would really fall into this. I do not think that that undergarments would in any way be problematic, because they're on your skin, and one wouldn't want to put on the same undergarments twice, I imagine. And therefore, we're talking about real garments. The idea of wearing a crisply pressed shirt that's been nicely laundered gives us an element of simcha, and this shouldn't be done during these days. One of the ways we avoid it, by the way, is if you haven't got used clothing to put on, is just before you put it on, drop it on the floor, so that it's doesn't have that element of being absolutely fresh and crisp and beautiful to get away with, or not to be in contravention of the idea of wearing freshly laundered clothing. We also, by the way, do not bathe or swim for pleasure. So now here in a modern world, halacha deals with people that are known as what is known as an istinus, don't know if anybody knows what an istinus is. An istinus is a person who's very fussy about their hygiene. Well, today we've got to be fussy about hygiene because of all sorts of other reasons. And we're washing our hands a lot more than usual, and we're making sure that things are washed, etc. I know that I was speaking the other day to a friend of mine who's a dentist, and he tells me that every day he comes home and his wife makes him get undressed in the garage and take his clothes and put them straight into the washing machine and wash them there, and whatever. He's not allowed to walk inside wearing clothes that may be contaminated. Okay, so they would have a problem with laundering clothes during this time, but that wasn't the question that he was asking me. We sometimes have the same thing where we are known as today as being in the category of being an istinus. An istinus is a person who is very fussy about personal hygiene. I think I'm right in saying that the majority of us are used to taking a bath or a shower every day. And the recommendation here is that one does that perhaps in a shorter way than you usually would. Don't stand under the shower for so long with the hot water on you that makes you feel good. Don't sit and bathe in a bath like you ordinarily would. Do it for the personal hygiene reasons only, and make sure that it is as brief as possible in order that we're not in contravention of this ruling as well about bathing during the 9 days. In addition to that, as we have had up until now, all the rules of the 3 weeks still apply during these 9 days, and that is we don't have weddings, we avoid simchas, we don't listen to music, etc., 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 and all of those things still apply. The Beit Din has just sent out a whole write-up about, people are asking during this time of the pandemic, should we be fasting or not? That's an interesting question in light of the fact that in pandemics of old, the rabbis determined that people should not fast during a pandemic. And why? Because it weakens your immune system, maybe. It makes you weaker, and you are, God forbid, you're more susceptible to the virus, etc. And they've actually told us quite clearly that, and in consultation with medical professionals, that anybody who is healthy still has to fast on Tisha B'Av. So here's the bad news for Tisha B'Av for next week. Anybody who is healthy still has to fast. If, God forbid, a person has this virus, they must not fast. And if they have really, really low immunity for a whole lot of other reasons, they also should not fast, but that should be in consultation with their own doctor and rabbi. But here's the grand bad news, is if Tisha B'Av is going to come along in its present form in 8 days' time, in a week's time, on Thursday of next week, if it comes along and Mashiach hasn't come yet, unfortunately, most of us will have to fast. Anybody who is not well should consult their rabbi or doctor. And of course, if you're on chronic medication and so on, all of those things need to be dealt with as well. But the fast, unfortunately, we still got to do if Mashiach hasn't come by next week, Thursday. So let's pause there for a moment and think about some things to do with the parsha of this week, which I think are fascinating, and I hope you find them fascinating as well. We begin reading this Shabbos the book of Devarim, the book of Deuteronomy. We read the first Sedra, the first parsha of the book of Devarim, and it is also called Devarim. But surprise, surprise, the first word of the parsha is the word Eile, Eile, which means these are. Dvarim are the things or the words. A davar is a thing or a word. And it says, Eile hadvarim, these are the words which Moshe Rabbeinu spoke to the Jewish people. What is the book of Deuteronomy? The book of Deuteronomy, it's often been something that I've maybe mentioned before. I'm not sure where some of these names come from. And it's interesting to note that word Devarim is a nice simple word. It means things. The word Deuteronomy, what does that mean? Does the word Deuteronomy in English explain more about what Devarim is? I don't think so. You know, it's like the joke of when you have a pair of tefillin, we all know what tefillin are. You translate it into English and we call them phylacteries. Does it help you to know that they're phylacteries? It doesn't explain anything. What are phylacteries? What are phylacteries that makes it better than tefillin? Tefillin is tefillin. It's easier to call it tefillin. So I'm not sure why we have to call it Deuteronomy, but anyway, the book of Deuteronomy or Devarim is really known in Halacha as being what we call Mishnah Torah. Mishnah Torah means really it's additional, it's extra. So the book of Devarim, of the 5 books of Moses, it's the last one. The book of Devarim is extra. What's extra about it? Well, everything in the book of Devarim is repetition. There's hardly anything in the book of Devarim that's new. So from this Shabbos, right up until Simchat Torah, we're going to be reading from this book of Deuteronomy, and it's all repetition. Now you might say to me, okay, each year we're actually repeating the parashas over and over and over again. There's a lot of repetition in Judaism. You know, you sit down to the Pesach Seder, you read the same Haggadah we read last year, you read it the year before, we read it again this year. So what's this whole chap of it being repetition? Well, this was Dafka, Moshe Rabbeinu's repetition. Moses repeats the Torah, or the salient points of Torah, to the Jewish people. Why was that necessary? Well, there are a few reasons. Reason number one is Moshe is talking to a new generation. The people who stood at Mount Sinai have died out in the desert. We're fast forwarding to the end of our sojourn in the desert, and Moshe Rabbeinu is talking to the generation who are going to go in and occupy Israel. He's giving them the briefing on all the things that they need to know for going in and occupying Israel. It's 40 years later. It's 40 years after the destruction. And we're told this was Moshe's his last will and testament. Moshe Rabbeinu was speaking here to the Jewish people and giving them his farewell, swan song, his goodbyes. Amazingly, we're told that Moshe Rabbeinu, Moses, spoke to the Jewish people here for 36 days. Now, the rulings are going to come out about what we're going to have to do this year on Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. As far as davening and shul is concerned, as far as services go and so on, can we go to shul? Can there be a number of people, etc., and so on? So you've got to stay close to your computers and your radios and televisions and whatever to find out if we're going to be back. Everybody wants to know, are we going to be back in shul for Rosh Hashanah? At the moment, I would put it at a 50-50 chance for some kind of davening in shul on Rosh Hashanah, because things seem to be improving a little bit, but I'm still not sure whether we're going to manage it entirely. But the one thing that they've said for sure will be, and I don't want everybody to cry together, the rabbis won't be able to give drushes. Now why? Because if we're allowed back in shul, it'll have to be short. The davening will have to be short. We'll have to tell people, daven up to a certain stage, come to shul, we'll have, I don't know, Torah reading, shofar blowing, quick musaf and go home. They want to try and mitigate the amount of people in the same place at the same time, so it'll be short. And one of the things I said for sure, rabbis won't be able to give droshes. Now, I know that you and I obviously only go to shul for the drosha. We go there just to hear the rabbi speak, because that's, of course, what draws everybody to shul. So the rabbis are going to be betwixt and between with their droshes for Yom Tov. Now, you and I would complain if a rabbi got up from his pulpit and spoke for hours on end, right? It would be most disconcerting. Moshe Rabbeinu speaks to the Jewish people for 36 days. It's his swan song. It's just before he leaves. 36 days he's talking to the Jewish people. Can you imagine that? But he had a lot of scope. He had a lot to cover. He had to give them the whole Torah. And he wanted to do something for them which was most unusual. And that was he needed to give the Jewish people who were going into Israel the same feeling. And we'll come back to this a little bit later. He wanted to give them the same feeling as they had when they stood at Mount Sinai. Speaking to a new generation, he had to transport them into a space and a place and an environment and a mindset and a spirituality that was the same as what happened at Mount Sinai. And that's what he does over these 36 days. Now, isn't it amazing that the word Eileh, which is the very first word of the book of Deuteronomy, Eileh, which means these are, is made up of 3 letters. There's an Aleph, and a Lamed, and a Hey. And if you take the number value, the numerical value of those 3 letters, Aleph is 1, Lamed is 30, and Hey is 5. The word Eileh is 36. It gives us an indication of how long Moshe Rabbeinu spoke to them. But there's got to be something deeper than that. And perhaps if we go a little bit further, we realize something else. And that is, in this parsha, there is another word that is fascinating at this time. And that word is the word Eicha. Now, on Tisha B'Av, if it occurs in the way that it usually occurs, one of the things that we do is we read the book of Eicha. Eicha. Eicha is the book of Lamentations. Lamentations, Eicha. That's when we sit down low and it's read in a mournful tune. And the word Eicha means like Eicha. How could it be? How is it? Eicha, it's a question. Eicha yashva badad. How is it that I'm sitting here alone? How is it that you have deserted us? How is it that the Jewish people have suffered? That's what that word Eicha means. And strangely enough, the whole book of Lamentations, starting with that word Eicha, has its foundation in this week's parsha. And that is that Moshe Rabbeinu, Moses, asks God in this speech that he makes, he asks God, Eicha, how could I cope with all the fusses and all the complaints and all the issues of the Jewish people? And the word Eicha occurs in this week's parsha. Now, strangely enough, the word Eicha also has the numerical value of 36. Eicha, Aleph, Yud, Chaf, and Hey adds up to Aleph is 1, Yud is 10, Chaf is 20, and Hey is 5. You've got 36 and 36. Eicha and Eileh. Sages point out that actually Moshe Rabbeinu was spending 36 days really admonishing the Jewish people. He wanted them to know that by the things that they had done wrong in the desert, by worshipping the golden calf, by complaining against God, by rising up in rebellion at the time of the spies, by rising up in rebellion at the time of Korach, all of these things, Moshe Rabbeinu repeats and he says, listen, look at the problems that you've caused. Look at the things that we've done. Look at our behavior. Here we were in a utopia. In the desert, we were in a utopia. We had food, we had water, we had Torah, we had everything. We were absolutely protected. We had life, we had everything. And we complained and we fussed. And we abrogated, and we cheated, and we played, and we did all of those things. And Moshe Rabbeinu said, Eicha, what am I supposed to do? And he's admonishing the Jewish people, and he's telling the generation that's now going to go into Israel, guys, you've got to learn from the past. You've got to realize that God doesn't want to take any nonsense from you anymore. that God took you out of Egypt to serve him, that he took us out of Egypt to receive the Torah, that for goodness sake, you've got a job to do. And this is words of admonishing. Moshe Rabbeinu is wagging the finger, and he's really telling off the Jewish people. He's admonishing them. What's he admonishing them for? So, if you take a look at the way that our sages have told us that our mitzvahs are divided, the mitzvahs of Torah are divided into two sections. There are positive commandments and there are negative commandments. Positive commandments are 248. Negative commandments, there are 365. Why 365? So one of the reasons that it says that there are 365 negative commandments is because in a solar year, there are 365 days in the year. And there are negative commandments which line up with our time. The 248 positives, we say, have got to do with the limbs in the body. 365 are either sinews in the body or time, the days of the year. The Zohar explains that the Jewish people, when they were in the desert, had fractured 36 mitzvahs. There were 36 commands, mitzvahs, that we had damaged. And therefore, we had damaged, in fact, 36 days. Moshe Rabbeinu is doing a repair job by speaking to the Jewish people for 36 days and admonishing them and getting them to do tshuva and bringing them back. He is actually fixing the 36 days that they had, in inverted commas, of the year, that they had tarnished, that they had destroyed, that they had broken, corresponding to the 36 mitzvahs, which they had directly broken. Remember, while they were in the desert, there weren't a tremendous amount of mitzvahs that they could do. And in fact, if we take it today, I don't know if you know this, but today there are probably only about 80, 90 of the 613 mitzvahs that we can do on a regular basis. The majority of our mitzvot, or a huge tract of our mitzvahs, apply to the temple and Beit HaMikdash. There are certain things we can't do. And then there are some mitzvahs that only apply to certain days and certain times of the year, Yom Kippur and Pesach and so on. On a regular basis, maybe 80, 85 mitzvahs, negatives and positives, that we can perform, that we can do. In the desert, they also were limited to what they could do. Zohar says 36. This was the number. So there's no coincidence here that the word Eile, which means 36, is Moshe Rabbeinu's speech. Eicha, which is the Book of Lamentations, which we're going to read on Tisha B'Av, if it comes along in its present form in a week's time, is also 36. And the idea here is that there's been some damage that's been caused, but there is a job and a role that we have to fix, that we've got to fix it up, we've got to rectify, we've got to put things right, we've got to make sure that everything is harmonious and correct and right once again. Now, over the last few weeks, if I could share with you, the rabbis have been meeting regularly on discussions about all sorts of things, how to handle a bar mitzvah at this time, how to do weddings at this time, and so on. There have been lots and lots of different meetings, and of course, updates from the medical professionals and thoughts about how and when it'll be safe to open shuls, etc. Just interestingly enough, I don't know if you know, but we're going to be headed to a phase when I think shuls are going to open in Cape Town before they open in Johannesburg, because things in Cape Town seem to have plateaued and are now on the way down as far as the infections go. So Cape Town might be opening before Joburg. So if you're desperate for a minyan, you'll have to probably drive to Cape Town, because I don't know if you're allowed to fly just for a minyan in these days. So that's strangely enough what's going to be transpiring in our country in times ahead. But rabbis have been talking. One of the features that the chief rabbi has got various rabbis to talk about has been lessons that we've learned from lockdown. And it's been fascinating. I've been listening to various rabbis talking about lessons learned from lockdown. And there's been the usual and then some of the unusual. And I'd like to share with you a couple of the unusual things that I've heard from colleagues about what we've learned from lockdown. And I want to focus in on just one or two. One of them, spelled out by a colleague about lessons learned from lockdown, has been, let's look at things in an unusual fashion. First of all, two of the major features, I think that he focused really on two of the major features of lockdown, and for us this period of time, have been social distancing and masks. Masks and social distancing. So let's first talk about social distancing. The idea of social distancing is not really new from a spiritual point in Torah. We always think about hugging each other or shaking hands and so on. But there was always a concept in Torah of giving people their space. And we talk about it as being the Daled Amos of Halacha. Give people, or the Daled Amos of a person, what is your space? You know, people often spoke about, I think there was even songs about something called space invaders. You and I know people who sometimes invade your space. Space invaders. Those are the people who really don't give you your space, either physically or emotionally. They take away from your space. I can think of sort of an example, you know, when the people don't understand, what do they call it, person-to-person spatial distancing in general. People who come right up to you and talk to you like in your nose, you know, they're sort of breathing all over you and whatever, and you, at the best of times, you want to say, 1 second, just back off, just give me my space. It's not nice. You're invading my Daled Amos. Daled Amos means my 4 square meters that really belongs to me. Don't come too close. Now, why is that important from a spiritual point of view? Is because it's an idea of respect. It's disrespectful for me to take away your personal space. It's disrespectful. Why or how do I have the chutzpah to take away your space? So the concept of social distancing, while we all know the problems and the issues and how lonely it can be, etc., 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 but the concept of respecting somebody else's space is a wonderful lesson that we've had from social distancing. And we should continue to respect other people's space. You have your space, you have your opinion, you have your ideas and ideals. Respect that spiritual space as well. What about a mask? This one I found fascinating was he spoke about the fact that a mask covers your mouth and your lips, predominantly the mouth and the nose, right? But predominantly the mouth. When you meet somebody and they're wearing a mask, can you tell if they're smiling at you? You can't tell if they're smiling at you because the smile is on the face, on the mouth, and that's covered. But in truth, he said, and quite rightly so, you actually can, because people smile with the whole face, not just the mouth. While the mouth might be covered, you know, when you talk about a real smile, you know, you can give some, you know, often when people are like posing for a picture, they move their mouth in a, you know, like a false smile. It's not a real smile. It's not a genuine smile. You can tell if a person is happy to see you if they smile with their whole face. If the eyes light up, we're always talking about, oh, his eyes or her eyes lit up. The idea of smiling with your whole face and particularly with your eyes as well is of paramount importance as well. So maybe we're learning that a little bit of more sincerity from the masks. The mask just covers my mouth. So you can't tell if my mouth is smiling, but you could tell if my eyes were smiling. Am I genuinely happy? Am I genuinely happy to see you? Or am I making believe? Maybe the mask is the thing that covers it over. Now, let's refer this now back to Torah in a way. Because in this week's Parsha, one of the things that is mentioned is God says, is Moshe says, Vayishma Hashem et kol hadvarim. Et kol divreichem, et kol divreichem. And not kol as in all, but kol as in the voice. Kol divreichem. Kol kuf vav lamed. The voice of your words. What does it mean? And I heard the voice of your words. Could we explain what does it mean, the voice of your words? Or the sound of your words, it's usually translated as? Why does the word kol have to be there? The idea of the sound of your words. So we all know that there's a big difference between something that's typed to you. So in other words, if you get an SMS, people sometimes prefer to hear your voice, right? They like to get rather a voice note or a voice message. It's refreshing, it's nice to hear your voice. Just to see your typed words, it's not the same. To hear your voice, much more, right? So there's the idea of that. But let's park that for a moment and move one step beyond that. And let me tell you a story here. Famous kind of an example that's brought about why it is that we talk about kol divreichem is that there's a story that is told about two people who had got into an argument, and the one had called the other one a thief. So imagine Ruvain and Shimon, and they get into an argument, and Ruvain says, Shimon, you're a ganef. Right? Shimon brings Ruvain to the rabbi because he says, I'm not a ganef. And they come before a din Torah. And the rabbi says to Ruvain, you need to publicly state that Ruvain is not a thief. And the way that I want you to say it is, what I said about, Shimon, what I said about Shimon being a thief is a lie. That's what you've got to do. So he says, okay, this is the finding of the Din Torah, and he's got to make the public apology. So he goes into shul on the following Shabbos, and he gets up on the bimah, and all he does is this. He says, what I said about Shimon being a thief is a lie. Yeah, he puts a question mark at the end of it. What I said about him. So they come shouting and screaming. What you like now? What are you doing? You know, my late father used to tell me in Dornfontein. Apparently, there was a tailor in Dornfontein in the years gone by who had a sign in his window. His name was Mr. Finkelstein. I'm sorry, Roz, but his name was Mr. Finkelstein in Dornfontein. No relation. He was a tailor, and he had a sign in the window that said, Mr. Fink, what you think? Me sell suits for nothing. So guy came in and he says, I want a suit. And he says, okay, fine. He measures him up. He gives him a suit. That'll be whatever it was then. I don't know, 5 guineas, whatever they charged in those days. That's the price. And he says, hey, but 1 second, look at the sign. The sign in the window says, you sell suits for nothing. He says, nah. You have to know how to read. It reads like this. Mr. Fink, what you think? Me sell suits for nothing? You got to know how to ask you got to know how to read. So you don't know how to read. So Ruvain stands up and he says, the thing that I said, that Shimon is a thief, is a lie. That's the way that he asked the question. So the rabbi calls him in and says, come on, you can't do this. It's made it even worse. You've told everybody, you've announced publicly that he's a thief when you were trying to announce publicly that he's not a thief. What are you talking about? So the guy says, listen, I wasn't trained in chazonis. I don't know how the intonations, the fact that it came out and sounded like that, what's wrong with it? So now, Torah tells us here, Moshe Rabbeinu was telling the Jewish people, there wasn't only something wrong with what you said, there was something wrong with your tone of voice as well. There was something wrong with the way it was expressed. And one of the things that one of the rabbis said about listening to others during this time, and he happened to be a person who had had this virus, unfortunately. And he said, you could tell the difference between, when he got messages from people, you could tell the difference between the people who were being what we would call Yotzer Zayin, who were just asking the question, and the people who sincerely wanted to know, who really, it was communicated, even if it was an SMS or a voice message or whatever. There's a big difference in the tone of voice. There's a big difference in what you can convey with that tone of voice. You can sometimes say exactly the same thing, and in the one way it sounds very empathetic and kind and generous and beautiful, and sometimes it can be downright callous and ugly and so on, using exactly the same words. So Moshe Rabbeinu teaches the Jewish people a number of important lessons here. It's not only about the things that you have done wrong, but it's maybe about how you did them wrong. It's not only about the words that you used, but maybe it's also about your tone of voice. It's not only about the things that you have broken, but it's really about, is there an effort and a commitment from each and every one of you to try and fix the things that you have damaged. And in fact, when we think about it, that is what this coming Shabbos is actually all about. The Shabbos before Tisha B'Av is known as Shabbat Chazon. It is the Shabbos of vision. Vision as in eyesight, vision. Why is it named that way? Is because on this Shabbos, the Shabbos before Tisha B'Av, we read the Torah, which is taken from the book of Isaiah, Yeshayahu, and it talks about the vision of Isaiah. But Isaiah's vision was one also of admonishing. He was also telling off the Jewish people and telling them that if we don't behave, God will take away his holy temple and so on. But it is known, the Shabbos is known as the Shabbos of vision. And the famous Rebbe Yitzchak of Barditchev said that it's on this Shabbos, and I've told you this before, I'll tell it to you again, that it's on this Shabbos that we're actually shown a vision of the third Beit HaMikdash, of the third temple. We're shown a vision in our spiritual beings, in our souls, of what that Beit HaMikdash will be like. Now, why would that be? One reason is that when you see something, you really believe it. When you just hear something, it's hearsay. Seeing something is really believing. So he says it's the souls of Am Yisrael, of the Jewish people on this Shabbos, are shown a vision of the Beis HaMikdash. Why? Because we want to have that emunah, we want to have that belief, and we want to have a vision, a view of actually what we're missing. And perhaps here's another lesson, therefore, from lockdown. During this time of lockdown, I don't know if I'm right in saying, but I think because something has been taken away from us, we miss it more. Had we not known anything about going to shul, etc., 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 we wouldn't have missed it. The fact that we know what we're missing, we've lost our access to our shuls, to our communities, to our Shabbos brachas, to the rabbi's drushes, to whatever it is that gets you going to shul, we've lost that access, so that's what we miss more. Now, we need to therefore have a real experience in what the Beit HaMikdash was about. Just hearing about it's not enough. We're shown a vision. We're kind of transported there on this Shabbos to really feel in our soul's mind's eye what the Beit HaMikdash, what the temple was actually really all about, so that we can know what we're longing for, what we really want back, and what we really have been thinking about and hoping will come very, very soon to us all. Moshe Rabbeinu is doing exactly the same thing for the Jewish people who are about to enter into Israel. They had heard Torah. He now wants to give them the experience. He wants them to have a vision of godliness. He wants them to see godliness, which they haven't seen as much as their parents saw at Mount Sinai. There's a new generation. They don't have the same kind of a gefühl, a feeling for it. You know, go and explain to someone who's never been to a Shabbos table what the smells are like at the Shabbos table, the fragrances of the chicken soup and the challah and so on. Go and explain to somebody what it feels like to sit at a Pesach Seder when they've never been to a Pesach Seder. We need the experience. The experience is addressing all our senses and making us really feel like we're there. And on this Shabbos, Rebbe Yitzchak of Barditchev says, the souls of every Jew are taken on a trip to see physically, although it's spiritual, to actually see, let's call it practically, to really see what the Beit HaMikdash, what the temple was really all about. So that we can feel it, so that we can know what we lost, so that we can long for it more, and so that we can make a bigger effort to get it back. How do we make the effort to get it back? Well, Moshe Rabbeinu gives us 36 days of talking, of telling us that we've got to adhere to all the things in Torah. We've got a Torah. We've got our mitzvahs. We've got the things that we know that the temples were destroyed for. Why were they destroyed? They were destroyed because we were social distancing in the wrong way. It wasn't just about giving other people space. It was about being nasty to other people. It was about saying, you know what, I don't want you near me. That's not the idea of social distancing. Social distancing from a spiritual point of view is, I respect you so much that I need to give you your space. I need to give your opinions their space. To tell you I don't want you near me is a very, very different style of social distancing. Where we talk about the ideas of why it was, or the reasons why the Beis HaMikdash, the temples, were destroyed, was because of idol worship. But it was predominantly because of a lack of love between people. There was no love, there was no sincere love, and even if we smiled, it was false. One last point. It actually tells us, in a strange piece of Talmud, tells us that one of the reasons that is given for the destruction of the Beit HaMikdash, of the temple, was because the Jewish people kept the law. I'll repeat. One of the reasons that the temple was destroyed was because the Jewish people kept the law. Not because they didn't keep the law, but because they did keep the law. So once again, I think it's got to do with this big word, kol, meaning the voice, the tone. Because there is a way of keeping to the law, and there's a way of either going above and beyond the law, or there is a way of making sure that the law is kept in an acceptable way for all the people around you. You know, I can keep to the law by making sure that I am preserved, that everything about me is fine. I couldn't give two hoots about you. Well, you know, we almost had this kind of an idea, an ideal when it came to, you know, sort of people breaking the rules and regulations in order to daven with a minyan, for instance. I've got to keep to the law. The law is that I've got to daven with a minyan. That's the law. But at a time like this, where I could be providing a framework for people to transmit a disease, and somebody might get sick, somebody might get hurt from it, I could keep to the law, but I actually, at the same time, I'm breaking another law. So I could keep to the laws that I need to keep to, but what about the ones that transgress, or that really take away from your space or your ability to function, or, God forbid, impact on your life in some way? That's not really keeping to the law. Or I could say, you know, the halacha tells me that I've got to give 10% to tzedakah. 10% of my earnings must go to charity. So a person comes to see you and says, could you spare a few bucks for me, because a few rand for me, because I don't have food for Shabbos. You say, 1 second. I've done the law. I've given my 10% to the Chevra Kadisha. I've done it already. So I'm keeping the law, but I'm not being nice. I think I've quoted to you once before that we once had a lady who worked for us who taught me a very important lesson by the following. There was a particular person who called her and was really rude to her on the telephone. And he happened to be a person who was of pretty high standing in the community, and he was pretty rude. And I, in apologizing for him to her, I said, you know, he's actually a good man. He's a good guy. Does a lot of good in the community or whatever, you know, like cut him a bit of slack. He's a good guy. And she said to me, he may be a good guy, but he's not a nice guy. Right? There's a big difference between, I suppose, between being good and nice. And maybe, because we're all hopefully pretty good, maybe we should work a little bit harder, each and every one of us in our own way, to not only be good, but to try and be a little nicer. The accent is important. The smiling eyes is important. The giving other people space is important. Making sure that it's not all only about me, but it's all about you is important. And let that come through in an attitude of sincerity. And where will we get it from? We get it from our vision. Do we have a real vision of what it is that God wants from us? Or is it just something that we've learned by hearsay and we're just going through the motions? We need to have our Yiddishkeit, our Judaism, our Torah, and our mitzvahs integrated into our behavior in such a way that every single thing comes across as being not only good, but nice as well. That every message comes across in the right tone, in the right way, and that the words that we say that come from our heart penetrate the hearts of those who are around us and bring us all a little bit closer together. So please God, we'll be able to go through these days of mourning by realizing that they're not just open-ended bitterness and crying, but that they really are all about fixing and rectifying and behaving well and making sure that we encourage others, that we reach out to others, that we are nice as well as just the proverbial being good. And hopefully in that way, come next week, Thursday, we'll be rejoicing at the rebuilding of the Beit HaMikdash that we will be shown a vision of on this Shabbos, rather than have to sit and mourn for it. So I want to wish you a very productive 9 days and a good Shabbos coming up as well. And remember, once again, we'll chat again in 2 weeks' time rather than next week on Tisha B'Av.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Rabbi Katz. Thank you.
Take care, everybody. Have a good week.
Have a good week and a good Shabbos and a good Chodesh.
A good Shabbos and a good Chodesh to you as well. Yes.
Rebbe, sorry to be on a personal note. That beautiful picture behind you of the Rabbi. Who is the young lady? Who is the young lady in the picture?
Very, very good. Okay, so let's show you there.
Yes.
Can you see it? I don't know. There's a reflection.
Yes, we can see the young.
All right. So strangely enough, that's not a young lady.
No.
All four pictures are the Lubavitcher Rebbe himself. The first one is a picture of him before he had his haircut as a child of 3.
Okay.
So it's a little girl. It looks like a little girl. It's actually a little boy with a long hair. It was before his hair was cut. I'll tell you something interesting about that picture. I don't know if you can see it there. Can you?
Yes.
There we go.
Yes.
Okay. So in fact, when they found that picture, they only found half of it. And an artist just drew the other side. There was only half a picture. And he sort of matched. Now you and I know that, your face, if you draw a line down the middle of your face, the one side is not exactly the same as the other. So part of that picture was guesswork. It's not actually entirely original. Yeah.
Beautiful. It's so beautiful.
And this was done. This was done by the artist Dean Simon. So this is a local guy, Dean Simon, who does what he calls photorealism. He does this is all done in pencil. It's a pencil portrait that he copied from pictures.
Absolutely magnificent. Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks for noticing.
Fascinated me every week.
Good. Keep well, everybody. Take care. Have a good Shabbos. Good week.
Thanks.